本次列车终点站森林公园，下一站新桥。
We are living in a rather noisy world. Again, I don't know about you, but every morning when I get on the subway and I try to hide myself in a corner, I try to focus on reading and try to get my day started. But I have to admit that the harder I try it, and it's much more difficult to stay focused. It's not just about the babies crying on the subway. It's not just about the conversation around me. It's really about the word disturbance. And I feel like the more I try to stay away from the noises and all the noises that keep on chasing after me. And again, when we look at this noisy world that we live in, politically speaking, socially and culturally, it's rather difficult for us to stay focused. And based on the survey today, that more and more younger generations, particularly we're looking at the children under the age of 15, are rather difficult to pay attention, not only in school, but also pay attention to the things around them. This is the question we need to ask. What is happening to our world today? And what about the word or even the phrase called paying attention? Why is it so difficult for us to stay focused? Is it because the presence of social media, or is it simply because we're too busy to be focused? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, and who is the Mr. Peter Schmidt. Peter is a writer and organizer from Clayton, Missouri, and his work has appeared in Foreign Affairs, the Baffler, and the Brooklyn Rail, and the New York Times. He serves as the founding program director of the Strother School of Radical Attention. And today we're going to talk to Peter regarding this topic of paying attention. Well, Peter, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thank you.
Well, Peter, again, this is a fascinating topic. And again, I have to say that I've been wanting to having this conversation with a scholar and an expert like you for a while. And again, as I mentioned in the intro, there's no denying that we are living in a rather noisy and a complicated world. And from your perspective, let's start with a conversation in a simple way. Why do you think today it's getting so difficult for us to stay focused? I mean, again, as an example I share at the beginning, I ride on the subway in the morning, and I simply want to hide myself in a corner, just focus on reading, just want to get the day started. But the harder I try it, and then the much failure or even greater failure that I face every day. What is happening to our attention span today? Your thoughts?
This situation that you're talking about, where we feel distracted, where we struggle to focus, you use the word noisy, is engineered. It's the result of a technologically sophisticated, highly capitalized industry that has arisen over the last 20 years in force, that seeks precisely to capture our attention, to maximize, in the case of sort of our devices, what's called the time on device, and then uses that extra 1/10 of a second that we have our eyes on a particular corner of our screen, to auction off what is effectively our eyeball time to digital advertisers, right? And so this is known as the attention economy. Many listeners will probably be familiar with that phrase at this point. And it's important to recognize this industry and the power of this industry. There's a huge amount of money behind it. A lot of the smartest graduates of the world's best schools are recruited into engineering and strategy positions in this industry. And what it means first and foremost is that when we're thinking about focus, we're thinking about distraction, or the particular domain of that conversation that my community is concerned with when we're thinking about the question of attention, we have to be very, very careful to recognize that it's a systemic issue and that any sort of response has to be commensurate to the size and complexity of that issue, which is to say, it doesn't serve anybody to be beating ourselves up about the fact that we can't focus. This is not like an individual problem. So a lot of the work that I have done as an organizer and facilitator, because I would position myself primarily as those two things, has been in relation to collective responses, right? Creating the conditions for people to get together, to understand how we're experiencing this new moment, to develop a shared vocabulary, and then to begin to ask the questions of how we can respond, what we can build in this new moment. There's a lot of talk in response to the rise of digital technologies and the harms that those technologies are having on mental health, particularly the mental health of our youth, on our civic fabric, on our ability to interact with people who disagree with us. Indeed, I think it could be said at the level of our planet, our ability to affect lasting, systematic change at the highest scale. We need to understand how to move in this new moment. Move as in affect a movement. That's really the approach that we've taken. And so, I'm an organizer and a facilitator. I'm not a scholar, and I don't really consider myself an expert. I think I'm more responsible for creating the conditions for asking questions around how to be together in this new moment. But one thing that we do know is that this has to be a collective response. The problem of attention is not going to be solved by better pharmaceuticals, by more responsibly designed mindfulness apps, or even necessarily by legislation. The way that our world hangs together now, the way that so much of our social lives have been subsumed by these digital platforms, signals to our judgment, my community, the Friends of Attention, and by extension, our project, the folks who are involved with the Strother School of Radical Attention. It signals to us that we're experiencing a historical shift, and that requires a critical consciousness. We need to really think of ourselves in broader historical terms. So I'm sure there's a lot to get in there. Maybe I'll toss it back to you.
Peter, as we mentioned, again, you touch on briefly regarding the word technology. I mean, again, there's no surprise that we are surrounded with technological advancement. And of course, that no one can argue and no one can debate that the technological advancement provide so much convenience into our lives. And we're looking at education, we're looking at business. Again, even today, we're looking at this complication of the political spectrum. But on the other hand, as we're seeing this unstoppable existence of artificial intelligence, again, I'm not a technologist. I don't have a background of research or even understanding and diving into the complication of this technological intricacy. But again, Peter, the question is very simple to you. Do we still believe, or based on your research, that the artificial intelligence, it's getting more complicated, or it's getting more, let me use the word creative, and it stretched our attention in a thinner way? So in other words, we would like to get everything done in a faster way, and that's why our attention is being challenged. So in other words, it looks like our eyes are looking at one thing, but our minds are running 1,000 miles an hour or trying to dissect information into 1,000 pieces. What do you say to that? Again, what is happening to this whole artificial intelligence or in technology that related to our desire of productivity and also stay focused? Does that make sense?
Yeah. First things first, you raised the obvious category of technology. It's important to say that our community, the Friends, right, our coalition of educators and activists and artists that's sort of based in New York, but we've got folks across the world. We're not anti-technology by no means. We think that these devices that we have, these platforms that we have, are extremely powerful, extremely useful, and we believe that technology cannot exist independently of its context. And in this conversation, the question is, what ends do these technologies serve? So you named AI, right? We think a lot about social media, but more specifically, what we call attention capture technologies, right? Which entails a combination of eye tracking technologies, you know, the development of cameras that could follow a person's retinal movements, a combination of predictive analytics, experimental psychology, marketing, and advertising, which come out of the discipline of experimental psychology. So the nexus of all these disciplines and all these kind of domains of engineering have created and supported this industry that seeks ultimately to make money off of our attention by capturing our attention. That is what we object to. That is where we see harm. And it's important to distinguish that from the phones themselves, right? People talk about getting cell phones out of classrooms as if phones were the problem. That takes for granted that cell phones will always serve the end of commodifying our attention, of taking our attention and turning it into money for somebody else's gain. And we're not so sure about that. We want to hold space for the possibility of a world where these devices can exist without serving ends that are fundamentally harmful to our well-being. So technology, we have to think about it in slightly more capacious terms. Now, people will often say, there have always been technological advancements in media and communication, right? The printing press, that shook things up a good deal. And that's certainly true. But this moment, while it does resemble historical shifts in the past that we would do well to attend to and to learn from, it is also fundamentally different. Cars, your average car, has increased by maybe a factor of 2 in its horsepower over the past, let's say, 60 years. The power of our computing, of our analytics systems, has increased by something like a factor of 1 trillion, right? So these are qualitatively different changes. Not to mention the fact that AI represents a level of complexity that is literally inscrutable to even the people who make it, or so they say. So it's not the same thing as the printing press or the advent of the radio or the television. Even were all important changes and certainly instructive for our moment. And so we need to be having conversations not just about the technologies themselves, because the technologies themselves could be oriented to a range of purposes, a range of social objectives. We need to have the conversation around what ends it's serving now, which is why for example, moving cell phones out of schools. I just got a message from a former teacher of mine, a high school teacher, who said that she's leading an effort to get cell phones banned from my public high school in Missouri. There's a number of folks in New York City who are leading the same effort. John Haidt, whose book The Anxious Generation is making a big splash right now, has made the case that we need to get phones out of schools, and that indeed we need to get phones out of the hands of kids. And certainly there is value to those proposals. And that strategy doesn't even begin to question the fact that phones could be used for good, or that they could at the very least serve some end other than the commodification of our attention, which is ultimately the commodification, we believe, of our ability to care for ourselves and for other people. And, the Friends of Attention, which is the group that I'm a part of, formed in 2018 at the Sao Paulo Biennial, came out of the art world, has done a lot of sort of thinking and writing and creative work together. We think about the politics of attention, and we think of ourselves in relation to the politics of attention. And the mode of politics that we practice has always been, let's say, a few steps back from the barricades. We're very interested in study as a mode of engaging this problem, which is why the organization that we kind of created to get out into the world took the form of a school, right? But there's a certain suspension of certainty, a certain and part of that is because we want to hold space for the possibility that there's a world where technologies can actually serve us. And I'll add one thing, which is that a lot of these conversations have to do with focus, focus, distraction, right? With focus generally being the sort of favorable mode of being, and distraction being a sign of, goofing off in class. That binary way of thinking, for one thing, it's basically punitive in its most extreme logic. We all got this from our elementary school classrooms. As if your eyes are on the board, you're doing the right thing. If your eyes are somewhere else, if you're distracted, you're doing the wrong thing. We want to push back against that way of thinking about attention. It forecloses a lot of possibility. And indeed, the heart of our work is about advancing a notion of attention that is free from the instrumentalizing discourse that has developed over the past 100 years. So the way that we think about attention, which often manifests in conversations about how can I focus, at the workshops that we lead at the school, which we call attention labs, a lot of folks come in off the street, and what brought them there is their realization that, they're looking at their laptop all day for work, and they find themselves unable to do the thing that they're supposed to do.
That's right.
Now that's real. That's real, and you know that is that's an experience that lots of people have, and it's worth taking seriously. And goodness, we want to be able to do our work. And if we think about attention exclusively in terms of productivity, of time on task, of minimizing distraction, we're foreclosing a huge terrain of attentive experience that we, the friends, believe constitutes a good deal of what it means to be a flourishing human. You know, and as it happens, you know, the work of my colleague Graham Burnett, who's a historian of science, examines the development of the laboratory study of attention from the late 19th century into the sort of mid 20th century. And his central scholarly claim is that in order to slice and dice human attention, in order en route to ultimately pricing it, making it a commodity, scientists had to develop new techniques, but they also had to develop a way of thinking about attention that could be sliced and diced, that could be quantified and measured, right? And this took place in laboratories with laboratory instruments. So by necessity, that kind of attention was instrumentalized. It was the kind of thing that could be kind of oriented toward a task. It could be measured. It could be quantified, and it's our claim that that way of thinking about attention has totally dominated the conversation, right? We think about attention. We think about the kinds of attention that can be captured by machines, and so when we're practicing attention, you, me, young people, we tend to practice the things that we know, that we have concept for. And that means that there's a whole range of attentive modes that are being neglected, that are really important. This mode of attention, of productivity, instrumentalized attention, is already and always pre-stressed for commodification, for capture, right? And so if we want to have a world outside of that problem space, we need to expand our notion of what attention is, right? We can't take for granted exactly what it is we mean when we use the word attention. That's a very different kind of problem than getting cell phones out of schools, although both are very important, and both, as far as I can tell, care about the well-being of people. And it's why that our work and my work takes the form of a school, is because as it happens, if you start looking around, lots of people have lots of very deep ideas about what attention is, you know? And it serves us to take those seriously. We, at the Strother School, which is our nonprofit initiative based in Brooklyn, we take very seriously the long traditions, the traditions of artistic practice, of scholarly inquiry, often humanistic inquiry, which is the mode of sort of the academy that has been mostly left out of this attention conversation. We take seriously the long traditions of political movement work, and indeed of the spiritual traditions, which represent the most ancient forms and modes of collective attention. And so we look to those traditions to have a more capacious sense of what it is when we're talking about when we use the word attention. Because we are interested in ultimately equipping ourselves and each other to build a world, then we think of attention as fundamentally a world building faculty, right? For you and I to create a world together, we need to be able to look at the same things and understand that we're seeing the same thing, even if we don't disagree on it, right? If we don't disagree on it, that moment is sort of square one of the messy work of politics. But to have any sort of functional politics, we need to know how to look in the same way. So that makes the conversation around attention a little fuzzier, right? Because we're not taking for granted precisely what it means.
Right.
But you can think of our work as a community. We are creating the conditions for that inquiry to happen, right? For people to collectively think about attention together, practice together, have a broader sense of what it is, and then to go out into the world and use that attention to whatever end. So long as we're stuck in the conversation of focus versus distraction, we're either going to be, well, put it this way, we'll always be acting by the logic of the very technological systems, kind of industries that are harming us. And there has to be a space outside of those logics of instrumentalization and commodification. So we're trying to create those spaces.
Peter, I want to talk about, again, this is something that you also touched briefly, especially related to the field of advertising. You know, again, before you and I, we have this conversation, and again, I was very impressed and amazed by the contributions and also the writings that you published before. But when it comes to the advertising strategies, again, that kind of tie into when we talk about social media, we talk about the internet, and also we talk about this online engagements. There seem to be a very, I want to be careful the word or the phrase is called satisfying terms, or even this strategic movement. It's called attention chasing advertising. And again, I think it's complicated for outsiders to understand it, but it's much easier, or it's even simpler for the insiders to describe that. But I want to get your explanation and help us with better understanding. How do you think that today, when we look at the content online, when we are being approached by marketers, you know, regardless the telemarketers or in person or however sorts of approaches, this strategy is called attention chasing advertising. How is it affecting our lives today? And why do you think that today, sad is to say, that we can't get away from it? So in other words, we as consumers, we kind of enjoy, or we kind of take pleasure of being the target by the marketers, by the advertisers, because the strategy they're using, because they simply to say they got our attention. What do you say to that, Peter?
Well, I've never been under the hood of these things. You know, I've never been on the other side of these technologies and the automated markets that raffle off these digital spaces. It's a sort of well-known idea that in advertising, we are the product, right? This was the foundational innovation of the New York Sun, a sort of penny daily paper in New York in the 1830s. Before that moment, advertising looks differently. You could say that it didn't exist. People would say, hey, look, I've got a sack of flour. Buy my sack of flour. And and somebody would buy their sack of flour, or they wouldn't. It was the innovation of the New York Sun to say, I have this corner of my newspaper, and you can advertise your sack of flour there, and I'll sell you the people who are going to look at it. Right? So that was the moment at which it became possible to sell newspapers widely beyond a sort of narrow echelon of wealthy subscribers who were seeking out kind of market information. And the model basically hasn't changed. That if you can ensure that a bunch of people are going to be looking at your patch of space or listening to your 15-second advertisement, you can sell that space to somebody who wants to sell their sack of flour to the world. What's changed in this situation is that we have tools that can powerfully predict human behavior. Predictive analytics is the sort of shorthand for it. And also that the engagement on our digital platforms, it goes both ways, right? We're responding to what we see on our screens, but our screens they're responding to us, and they're measuring us all the time. And so there is a kind of symmetry of engagement that means every moment these technologies are getting better at understanding what we want. This is when people talk about the algorithm, which has become obviously sort of a vexed term. They're referring in part to the fact that everything that we do becomes fuel for future advertising. So that's a qualitatively different moment. And I'm the program director of the Strother School. We're a school. We really are a school. And I think that the work of study, the kinds of things that we do in schools, is a really important mode of response to this problem. Advertising is all about desire, right? It's both about meeting people's existing desires, but also, more importantly, in this overabundant age, it's about engineering new desires. The best definition of education that I've encountered so far was put forward by the post-colonial literature scholar Gayatri Spivak, who said that education is the non-coercive reconfiguration of desire, right? So you're giving people the tools and the opportunities to choose what they want to want. And in that way, the work of study, the kinds of stuff that goes on, at least hopefully, one hopes, in a good school, is perfectly oppositional to the work of advertising, which is the coercive arrangement of desires. And so I believe in that work, getting people together, thinking deeply, creating the conditions for critical consciousness, for people to be able to look at the world and see it from different angles, and ultimately to decide what they want to want. We need ways of responding to advertising that regulate the industry, that we need practices that can protect us from its sort of ubiquity, right? We need to be able to turn our phone off, say, and leave it outside of our bedroom.
That's right.
But we also need to be equipped internally and interpersonally to decide what we want. And that is something that's the kind of solution that's not going to come from the top down. We need to do it ourselves. And that's the kind of work that we do at the Strother School.
Well, Peter, I want to wrap up our conversation by asking you the last question. Again, you are the director of the Strother School of Radical Attention, but we start the conversation with intelligence, our artificial intelligence, and then we talk about this marketing strategy. Now, we are looking at, again, as I mentioned in the intro, Peter, the complication or even this sophisticated system structure of our political system today. I mean, regardless this political campaign that we see online or this political campaign speeches that we're listening to in person, how do you think that today, as audience, as viewers, when we look at this political movement, and regardless it's in the US, it's in Southeast Asia, it's in Europe, how do you think that for audience, we are part of this crowd and we are part of this target audience? How do you think that today we are actually responding to the political messages and also that go along with the word attention? I mean, again, how do you think that this political strategists are able to understand the science behind the word attention or even the study behind attention so that the candidates or even the speeches or the words can resonate with the voters or even connect with the voters today? I mean, again, it's a very simple. If you lose the attention of the audience, people are going to walk away and no one is going to be interested, regardless if you're doing this in person or online. But this is such a huge market. Even to borrow a word that you used at the beginning, is attention economy. So how do you think that today this political movement are actually taking advantage of the study of attention and able to get the desire or even create something exciting for the audience? I want to hear your final thoughts.
Yeah. There's a great work by the American historian Jill Lepore, a book called If Then, where she chronicles the rise of what's called the Simulmatics company, Simulmatics, which ultimately sort of fizzled out and was not a successful company by any means. But they were the first people to suppose that early computers, we're talking punch cards here, could be used to predict human behavior. That was not a familiar idea. And in fact, many people found it for reasons that were obvious then and are perhaps even more obvious now. They found that idea distasteful. And one of the insights that arises from this story is that in order to predict human behavior, they first had to figure out how a computer could read the population, right? How do you take a population, a kind of set of behaviors, and put it into the machine in the first place? The way that they did that was dividing up the US population into a number of categories. Can't remember how many it was. It was maybe, in the hundreds, 300, 340. Demographically split up. So single mother, white, owns a refrigerator, say, or Central American immigrant, lives in the city, works 2 jobs, for example. They needed to be able to partition the population in order to kind of feed that population into the machine. The result being that the machine could only produce results based on this simulation of the population that they had created with their mode of measuring it. These machines began to be used in politics. Both parties started using them to figure out strategy, right? And that's the moment at which the model becomes the mode of doing politics, right? Because suddenly they were strategizing around demographic categories that had been produced for the convenience of the machine, but now they were making them real in their organizing. They would then convene people who fit XYZ demographic categories and treat them as an existing category, not some sort of like procedural engineering convenience. The long story of that process is that politics has become a problem space, you might say, that comprises a set of problems that can be computed, right? It has become, in effect, a sort of optimization problem. And we see that in the ways that we are fed information, that users are targeted with political advertising, the ways even that people decide how to vote. They go on 538, the blog that does political and sports forecasting, and they think, well, what's the best use of my vote? Now, thinking what's the best use of my vote, that's a perfectly reasonable way to think. The issue is that our sense of politics is foreclosed by the tools that we use to measure it and to conduct it and to guide politics. And that's an issue because, we believe that politics is more than an optimization problem. Politics entails our whole human selves, all that murkiness, that we run the risk of language falling out of politics when it becomes a purely quantitative problem. And we've seen that. We've seen the cheapening of language. In the US, this is what people are talking about when they say post-truth, when they talk about fake news, is that our collective sense of what language can be trusted to represent has been terribly eroded. And that's because language has been subsumed by numbers, by probability, by the kinds of things that can be calculated. So we want to return to a mode of politics that is human first and foremost. And that's a big claim. So what exactly does that look like? Well, as I said, my work is to create the conditions for the inquiry, right? Politics has to happen with people. It has to happen with people together. And if we want to do it on our own terms, it has to happen with people who are sharing the same space rather than acting through these platforms that already have their own obscure interests. So as an organizer, it's my job to get people out of their houses and get together, sit around a table somewhere. We do lots of work called sidewalk studies, where we convene little pop-up study groups throughout the city of New York, and we do readings together. We do practices of attention. All of it happens out in public space. We really believe in bringing people together. And we don't know exactly what that will produce. This is not a kind of programmatic politics where we say, if we do this, then the following steps will happen and we will achieve X, Y, Z. But we've lost the ability to even have those conversations in the first place. And we've lost the ability to kind of imagine a form of collective decision making that isn't mediated by these tools, that ultimately operate by the logics of optimization. Mm-hmm. We want to return to a politics that has space for the very things that make language resistant to computing, which is ambiguity and mystery and affect and the embodied nature of, saying something, putting it out into the world. So that's the work that we do, and that's an example of how we think about politics. Is again, we want to have a more capacious sense of what we mean when we use the word politics.
Well, again, Peter, it's fascinating to hear from your perspective that when we link technology and marketing, advertising, and social media, and all the way to politics with the word attention. I mean, again, this is a conversation that I believe that everyone should have, and also this is something that we should continue to invest and continue to elaborate upon. But again, it is fascinating to discuss or having the conversation with someone like you. Well, again, ladies and gentlemen, it's such an honor to talk to Peter Schmidt. Again, Peter Schmidt, it's a writer and an organizer from Clayton, Missouri, and he serves as the founding program director of the Strother School of Radical Attention. Well, Peter, it's been a pleasure, and again, we thank you so much for your time. We love to have you back on the show as we continue to pay attention, not just about the word attention, but also really about this evolution, or even the word is called revolution, and around the surroundings and what's happening to us, and why is it important for us to continue to stay focused. So thank you so much for doing this, Peter.
Thanks for having me, Will.